I would just love to dive into like, your perspective on CDP, and I can speak to that. We can kind of start from there and bridge over. I think a lot of the implications, I think CDP is one of the places where there's some of the starkest implications for the current landscape.
Of the more funnier discussions really happen before you actually get into the actual podcast. And sometimes I've been chatting with people for like 10 minutes already, and we're already touching on subjects. I'm like, geez, we need to hold off on this because, we need to start on this before we need to start recording before we actually start diving deep into this. But yeah, no, I get the drift about that. Yeah.
Yeah, check it out sometime, and I think it's pretty fun. Um, and
Rick
so,
Rubin. Yeah.
yeah, I would love to just, I would just love to dive into like, your perspective on CDP, and I can speak to that. We can kind of start from there and bridge over. I think a lot of the implications, I think CDP is one of the places where there's some of the starkest implications for the current landscape, because
Yeah.
a lot of the other parts of Martech, let's say like engagement platforms, what those are really doing is just verticalizing on top of a delivery layer.
Yeah.
So what that means is a typical, what a CRM or CM platform is, it's ultimately at the base is providing the address system and the delivery system for email, for push notifications, for SMS, where it's really managing, right, like the device ID and the address and making sure the delivery pipeline happens, especially at scale. But that becomes quickly commoditized, and you have some delivery layers like a Firebase or Twilio, which really just provides the
Yeah.
pipes. And then they're usually used by developers early on in a company when it's really just transactional messaging or something else. A thing that Twilio doesn't really provide is the UI and the business intelligence and the rules logic that has traditionally been used and needed by a marketer or a product manager. So then that's when they bring in something that is what I would call verticalized, in the sense of a provider that has the delivery layer, but on top of it, it has some complex UI with a lot of expansive properties and functionality that a marketer would use to kind of segment and do a lot of things. Um, and it's verticalized, but what that means is that like where AI is probably not going to disrupt, in a sense, agentic is not going to disrupt, is that delivery piece, because
Hmm.
delivery has to be managed. It's just like even the smartest human would do the same thing. They would implement the implement the law the address system, right? So
Yeah.
that doesn't get replaced, but what isn't needed as much is the business logic on top. But then what a CDP does is mostly move data, or, as I understand it. And as a data scientist, by the way, I actually only learned about CDPs fairly recently, because most data teams don't use CDPs. Those are tools that are implemented to make data accessible to marketers and to product teams. But data teams we use, the actual data sort of lake, the data infrastructure provided by a GCP or an AWS or Databricks or Snowflake. And so but what the CDP does is move data from one place to another, and let you then, flexibly manipulate it in some way to create a segment or create a rule, et cetera. I think agentic AI has more implications for CDPs than it does for the CRM at first, because the delivery is so important.
Yeah.
Now, how that like verticalization changes over time is a different question, because definitely the business logic on top is not so relevant anymore and isn't very useful. But you still need the delivery layer. So
Yeah.
um, anyway, I would love to hear, yeah,
No, no, no,
more
absolutely.
perspective.
That's one of the reasons I started looking into contextual CDPs. I just wanted to throw my own acronym in there. Everyone seems to be doing it. I think the last good one I heard was XCDP by Lytics, just before they got purchased by Content Stack. But what I really find interesting is that there is just so much data available in data warehouses, or within, if you're using a package CDP in the platform that they're storing your data. So I mean, that's a whole separate discussion by itself. But a question I get asked a lot, even just yesterday from a guy from England, it says, how do you get this to work? Do you need to rip out the system? Is it a plugin? Is it a layer you need to add to it? And to your point, the business logic is AI something that's going to also dictate the business logic? If you look at, these activation platforms that you're mentioning, these engagement CEPs that drive. You do the orchestration, you do the segmentation, you do the orchestration, and then you do the timing for sending out that data. I see AI playing in a lot of the fields in that area. One is, working with the data to answer certain questions about that user. What's their sentiment towards the brand? What is what is the product they're most likely to purchase next? I mean, this is what we were doing ML for the last decade. Based on all this data, we're trying to guess. But now with AI, it's going to make it a whole lot easier. So you have a whole data point angle, but you also have a more automation angle. And that's where I see so many opportunities. But then agentic AI comes along, or AI agents, and it becomes even grandioser. I mean, there are so many possibilities. But I think that's where the big question lies for companies. One, how do they start adopting this? I take it that a lot of companies, I've read somewhere even today, every company is working with data. If you have a website, you're already working with data. So everybody is working with data. So there's always an opportunity to see, hey, what can we do with that to leverage it to our benefits? Now, if you're looking at a lot of customer data, you can derive or infer new values from that and make that work for you in, let's say, your orchestration layer. So, how do you determine the way you approach your users? There are companies out there that have applied AI to the decisioning mechanism. What's the right channel to use? What's the right time to send a message to? And what should the message be? What kind of tone in the voice? And it's exploding massively that it's really hard to put the finger on something and say, hey, this is the way that it's going to work. But AI agents, and I've only been dabbling in that for about a month now. But I've seen examples of companies who have built in this technology to say, hey, I need an answer right now to a specific question on the data, on the customer database, on the product database, and everything's put into one. So you have your MCP. You can, it'll be able to get from your question, be able to know where it needs to look to get that answer and properly return that to you. But AI agents, I mean, what you guys are doing, like the guys over at Teeling just said, hey, we're in this process, we're learning along the way. But from the sounds of Aampe, you guys have, and the last time we spoke, you've been building on this. So I'm really interested to hear what makes AI agents kind of different from other AI agents and different from things like MCP or Gen AI. I mean, how does that affect the positioning of Aampe? That's a lot of talking without coffee even this afternoon.
There's so many dimensions to this conversation.
It is. Yeah, we need to narrow that down, right?
Positioning is a fascinating one for everyone to understand, and definitely for folks that are building to understand, because the way we position, the way we explain things will have a huge impact on the ability for enterprises, for customers, for organizations to effectively adopt and evolve. I would say there, if we kind of just sort of hierarchy cluster all the dimensions to the conversation, we just sort of break it down to like the simplest dimension that splits the conversation in the most useful way. I would say the split in the starting split is a lot of is all this stuff about how and the why of the how, like it does it this way versus it does it that way, etc. And that tends to be what we would call technical and has to do with substantial differences in methods and mechanisms, etc. And that's important. And it's easy to get immediately sucked into that, especially as someone. I mean, I spent most of my career building that stuff, and so I like it, I enjoy it, and I know why it matters. But the other side of the split, the other cluster at the top or at the bottom, depending on which way you're looking, is what are the implications and what does this matter to me, and how does it affect me? And I want to call out what you just, you said one of the things you said right at the top was, what happens to the business logic? Does this begin to dictate the business logic?
Yeah.
And actually, a question I hear all the time is just like, well, what does it mean in a world of agentic AI, in a world of agents, et cetera? Where's my, do I lose control? And dictate and control are two, they're referring to the same concern and the same question about the mechanism by which the humans interact with these systems and control these systems. And where is the hierarchy and where's the influence? And I would say it's really important. So I'm going to start on that side of the cluster and not get kind of pulled into the technical. I think we'll get there, but we
Yeah.
want to start with what are the implications, and then we can get into how those play out. I'm going to reframe because it's very easy to say you lose control or does AI dictate the business logic? And I want to say actually what's happening is agentic allows you to expand and evolve the business logic.
This sounds a lot more positive than the
It is,
dictate part. Absolutely, yeah.
it is a lot more
You're,
project. The problem with business logic today is that it's incredibly sort of overly simple and
yeah.
naive. And it's forced to be naive because of the technical capabilities that are extended and enabled for the business leader.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you think about it from the position of like today, or really 2022 or 2020, what business logic meant, you don't want to think about it as, oh, I'm changing that business logic, I'm dictating at that level. What you want to sort of say is, no, in fact, you're expanding the logic to be far more sophisticated and expressive. And the AI is enabling that, which means the control layer goes higher. And so, yes, you do have to be more sophisticated, but your control is actually increased because you're not controlling minor tactical details. You're controlling broader patterns. No
Your
one would
control
say
of productivity, maybe then?
your control of productivity, but you're even your control in your capability of what's possible to do. Um, no one would say, we both have a military background, right? So no,
Yeah.
no, when I was in Afghanistan, no one would say a general has less control than a captain or a sergeant, but they definitely they manifest that control very differently, right? Like a sergeant gets in
Yeah.
your face and yells at you and gets you to clean your gun, and a general doesn't do that, but a general has way more control.
Yeah.
Um, uh, to kind of make it more technical in business, which would be more familiar to probably most of the folks listening, or folks in our world. I think about it, and if we also begin to extend this into why this matters from a data perspective, I would sort of say, and I was just in New York. I just came up to Boston from New York, and I think New York is a great example of this because it's such a complex and large city. Um, and a really good analogy for control, for planning, for anything is a map. A map expresses some relation of points. And it can be geographic points, or it can be points in time, it can be points in just like this landscape of opportunity. A map is a useful analogy. A model is really just another word for a map.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a more abstract version of it. And a great example is the New York subway system. It's a massive subway system, and it's many complaints about it because it's so old, but it's also incredibly effective in terms of transporting millions of people around every day. And the map of that system can be fit into this very small 2x2 space in a poster on the wall of the metro car or of the station. And it lets you figure out how to get from Brooklyn to the Bronx and Manhattan to Queens and point to point. And it's really effective at that. And you can walk up to that map having never been in New York, and with a little bit of work, more work than you need, let's say in Singapore, where I've been living, or Boston, which is much smaller. But with a little bit of work, you can figure out how to get from one point to another point. And so it's great. It's very useful because it's compressed, it's an efficient representation of the system, and you can get from one point to the other. But if you step out of the subway station and you go up onto the street and you say, I want to, it's a beautiful day, I don't want to use the subway, and you try and use the subway map to get from Brooklyn to Bronx, you will
Yeah.
fail.
Good luck.
It's not going to work.
No.
It's not. and I use the word expressive. It's not expressive enough. It doesn't capture enough dimensions of the world. It doesn't tell you anything about topography and street patterns, and it's not even really proportional to the scale,
I've
right?
yeah,
A great
I've seen actually someone do the same with the London Underground. They mapped it to the actual location and then compared it to what you see
that's
in the underground, and it's nothing like it. But I get your point. It's a simplified view. Yeah.
it's a simplified view. So I would say today, but that's all we can fit on that 2x2 space, and that's really
Yeah.
all you need to get from one point to the other. Now, traditionally, 30 years ago, in a world of far fewer SKUs or far fewer like business dimensions, because we just didn't have, the possibility to do more than that. I mean, when I was growing up, when I was growing up in the US, right in the 90s, you'd go to a Walmart, and within a Walmart, that was the store in your town. And there's about, a typical Walmart had about 80,000 to 120,000 SKUs. And that was the world of everything you could buy. And maybe you could find a catalog, or you could go to the bigger town and go to the mall, and there'd be more
Yeah.
stores.
Sears, J.C.
That's
Penney's.
it,
Yeah.
right? Today, Walmart online offers 4 to 500 million SKUs. The world has exponentially exploded, and that's true for every business. The possible services that you have exploded, and that means the choice and optionality has exploded. And so that means that the simplified map is not a great map for navigating all those business opportunities. But what we're doing is trying to like kind of use that. That's where we're implementing our business logic. So if in, let's say in marketing, you're basically implementing at the level of a subway map. You're saying, here's my segment for new users, and here's my segment for users who are about to churn. As
Yeah.
if like the world of users, your people or 100,000 people can express in those two segments. But that's all you have, the representation for. That's really all you can really express using the logic and the system that has been enabled.
Yeah.
And immediately what Google Maps did is incredible, right? And again, you and I grew up in a world with no Google Maps, and I still remember the days when I would see, the Google vehicles driving around Boston and
Yeah.
driving around New York, mapping the
I actually
city.
had a chance to drive in one of those. Actually, they were looking for people to do that. It would have been wild. Yeah.
It was fantastic because you're driving along the street and you're sort of seeing, wow, he's capturing this address. I remember we used to look at Google Satellite, and you would sort of see, your friends sitting out in front of their house, because they captured right happen when the car
Yeah.
goes
This
by.
was before they even blurred the faces. They had unblurred faces for a long time too, and people would just hunt for things on Google Maps. But no, yeah. Back to
So
you.
the expressiveness has exploded, and that's great, but it's sort of too much to absorb at the level of a subway map. You
Yeah.
can't fit all of that in a subway map. And so that's the question, is just where are you operating? How are we operating? And the data that we generate to create that much richer map, which ultimately is more useful. It's just more useful for a lot of different separate purposes. We shouldn't have one campaign for new users and one campaign for churning users. We should have millions of campaigns, or really just contexts in which
Yeah.
you can, as a brand, can interact with an end user. And so is that less control? Only in a very weird, narrow sense. Because yes, you can't manage a million independent conversations.
Yeah.
You can't even do that with humans. If you're growing a business and you hire 100 salespeople or 100 whoever, or customer service representatives, you can no longer sit next to each one of them and control their conversation with the customer. But you don't want to. That's kind of almost a bizarre notion to think that you would do that. No, delegation is power. Delegation is
Yeah.
advancement. You say 100 people. What you have to do is make sure you train those people. You have to make sure that they're ready to have those conversations effectively, and that they're following within get brand guidelines and all the other things, compliance purposes. But beyond that, the power is in the delegation. It's saying to that young person who joins your company, go and be successful, be responsive, use your intelligence to listen to what your customer is saying, and then say something meaningful to them in response. That's far better than, you as the executive having to go and have those individual conversations. And I think it's very similar for marketers. It's like, don't set up these rules where you control exactly those things. Control the broader parameters. And what that results in is a much more expressive and meaningful result for your end customers, as well as for your business and for your understanding of your business.
Yeah, I think the analogy even there, even with the business life, the underground was great. But even just organizations, when you a small startup, you'll have direct connections, one-on-one connections, short lines of communications with everyone in the team. Even within a scale up, you might start delegating within a scale up. As soon as you start getting into enterprise, you'll indeed need to have your C-suite in place, your VPs, your heads, etc. So you are still in control, but as you say, at a much different level. And delegation definitely plays a role into that. How does that fit into the? I think I have an idea of how that fits into the agentic AI. We need to come up with a definite term for this. Is there officially a difference between AI agents and agentic AI?
Yes, there's a really important distinctions, and I would prefer to use the word agentic AI and agentic infrastructure. I think when you're thinking about it practically and tactically, it's fine to talk about your agents, and it's important to think in those terms. But when we're talking about the systems, we should really call them agentic systems.
Okay. So how does that delegation fit in with agentic AI then, especially within Amp? How do you envision these
Right.
this working? How do
We
you build
understand.
your
Yeah,
army?
that's right. So now we have a much better, what we've done now so far is have a much better context for what are the implications for us as humans, for human marketing leaders, et cetera. And we know a little bit more about just a better way to think about what's going to happen. Now we can kind of come back to the root of our tree and go the other direction into the other cluster, which is the mechanisms, the methods, like how it works and the why for the how it works. Not the why at the business level, but the why of like why method A versus method B.
Yeah.
Okay. We can also kind of bring in the question of data at this point because oftentimes, and I'd say predominantly, we think in terms of data. We've learned to do that in the last 10, 15 years. People have learned to think in data. They've learned to think in big data. And they've learned to think in the fact that, oh, data goes here and data goes there. And we want to be data driven and we want to make decisions based on data.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's time for another massive reframing and relearning. Because data is just a sort of it's a passing component. It is a very transient representation of that much richer world.
Mm-hmm.
And it's needs to be kind of capable of reflecting the aspect of the world that you care about. And also, as we interact with that world, it needs to be representative of the counterfactuals of the different action choices we have as a business. So when we talk about data, when we sort of say the data is so valuable and we just need to move it from one place to the other, I'd say no, actually the data is mostly not very valuable. We've massively uh, um, over out kind of overemphasize the value of data and the value of moving it around. In fact, what is really powerful is the data generating process. It's
Yeah.
the thing that generates the data. So it's your application that creates some instrumentation that keeps a record of something that happened in that moment and keeps an expressive record in that moment. So almost any marketing manager or product manager, et cetera, is going to know about that experience of sort of saying, what's in our data and talking to the engineer and realizing, if we want to really capture, we think as a business, this context and the general user journey is really important. The point where a user comes into the application and does this, it's
Mm-hmm.
really important. That's our aha moment. And then they're like, so we want to see that data and we want to see the analytics around that moment. And the engineer says, we don't have that data. And they're like, what? We don't have that data. Well, we just didn't instrument it. It happened in time, but we didn't create a record of it, or we didn't create a record of the attribute associated with it. So the user clicked it, but it kind of got lost in the ether of the log stream. It's not in a place that we can represent. So the key thing that you do is you go in there and you say, every time this happens, keep a record of it and keep a record of this and this and this about that instance. And that's what you do.
Yeah.
And that's the human job, is to do that. Now, what happens again, product marketer and marketer or product manager with some experience will have experienced this when they say, let's do that. And then they come back, and a few weeks later, they're looking at the analytics and they're looking at the data and they're realizing, oh my God, I realized that there's this really important intermediate step and we weren't thinking about it at the time and we didn't instrument it. So
Yeah.
it's not in the data. But then you have to go back to the engineer and you have to wait till the next quarter because then there's some to capture that new piece. And by the way, capturing that new piece logarithmically increases the size. So by the way, your bill is going to go up this much because Datadog is going to charge you, or Segment's going to charge you, or however it else it is going to charge you. And so then you don't have it. So let's make do, or let's not, run a campaign at that point because we don't know that point happened. Kind of come now to your question, right? What agentic infrastructure represents. When we say agentic, what we really mean is it's not that complicated a word. It relates to the word agency. Agency is just a word that says that you have the agency to, you're an agent in the world. You can make a decision one way or the other. That
Yeah.
means you have
Yeah. The
agency.
capability of doing
So,
something. Yeah.
so infrastructure that is agentic means the infrastructure has the agency to make a decision. Now, I've said what's most important is the data generating process. That's the thing that creates the data. Right now, the human has the agency, and the flip side of agency is responsibility. Every time you have the power to do something, you have the responsibility to do that thing. You have the responsibility to do that thing correctly or properly or effectively, not ineffectively or fraudulently or corruptly, right? And so it's the human responsibility to go in there and make sure the data generating process is set up in the right way to capture the data so that you can then make an inference about it and move forward, et cetera. But that human in the loop is so slow. You have to know in your mind everything about the context, and then you only ever really understand it when you actually observe it. And this is true for everything, right? As an artist, you kind of have to sketch something out before you realize, no, the layout or the perspective isn't right. As a cook or a chef, you make some dishes, you have to put the two ingredients together to realize that we learn by practice.
Yeah.
We learn by practice as analysts or as marketers by putting things together and realizing, oh man, we didn't capture what we needed, or we captured it in the wrong way, or we need this additional point. But then because it's a human and then it's a human engineer and a human marketer, and you have to go back, that's so slow. What agentic infrastructure represents is the infrastructure itself has the agency to kind of tabulate what it's tracking, to sort of modulate.
Understand and see where it needs to improve or change things.
And well, that's the second step. It needs to just know that it can track a particular thing, or it should track a particular thing, or it should add an additional thing. And then comes the question immediately, well, what should you track? What is important? What piece of data? And then that's where the other human in the loop traditionally comes in, which is that now it's your analyst. So your engineer has gone ahead and been like, fine, I spent the time, I instrumented it. And your marketer's like, yes, I did it. But then they're like, but it was just based on a hypothesis that this was the aha moment. We don't really know if it is. So now I need to go and access my analyst to do, some statistical model over 3 months of data of 3 months of people going through that aha moment and then having some subsequent moment in which they pull out their checkbook or swipe their card, right?
And all driven by a initial use case because you are trying to, yeah.
That's right. And so there's a lot of things changing, and then but you need to look at it and see if it's effective. And so that's also a key part of the agency. You don't just need to have the capability to flip or modulate something. You need to do that based on some awareness or some learning that thing matters. And you never know something matters in advance. So in a sense, you're always experimenting. And that's the other part that we miss a lot of times is we say data, but data science, the science part of data science is so critical. Human knowledge has advanced through the scientific method, through science, and science is about creating data by trying something, by intervening in the world and observing the result. And the intervention itself is sort of splitting. It's sort of saying we have medicine A and we have medicine B. We've created two medicines and we're going to try them. We've created two versions of our homepage. Let's try both. it's the experimentation part. So you also need the infrastructure to have the agency to run the experiment.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of pieces here, and what you're trying to do is create a software stack. What agentic infrastructure represents, or agentic systems represent, is software stacks begins to be able to have the agency to do tactical things at each one of these levels in concert, in coordination, so that a human team doesn't have to constantly manage those small, narrow tactical decisions. We
Yeah.
can all become generals and less corporals and sergeants running around making extremely narrow decisions on a vast, complex battlefield.
I mean, if you want to even draw the comparison with the Walmart SKU story, in the 90s, we had maybe 80,000 SKUs, different products within the Walmart in your town. And I try to compare that with A/B. So the kind of the comparison I'm drawing in my head right now is A/B testing from like a decade ago. You had Optimizely, for instance, was one of the bigger ones, um, uh, enabling you to do A/B testing at scale. But it was all very static. You had you could have people enter a test based on a certain action that they did on the website, or if they saw something, or there was a trigger, and they got pushed into this kind of testing sequence, and you expected a result. But it was very static, was very dry. There wasn't a lot of variety in it. Now, if you look at Walmart now, and going back to that case with that A/B testing, it's you cannot create 300 tests and say, hey, we've tested it on everyone and we know everyone's wishes, or preferences, or how to convince them, because let's say you have 20 different variants. You're pushing 20, all your people into 20 different variants, and in effect, your outcome is already skewed before you even begin. And I think the comparison now with what Aampe is doing is saying, hey, this is a buzzword from like 2 years ago. People were really shouting it all around me. This hyper personalization, and not necessarily on a content level, but also on that process level. And I think that's what agentic AI, as I hear you describe it, should be able to deliver for us. We're no longer looking at that, push them all into one funnel and see where they end up. Everyone's got their own funnel.
That's right. And the reason why I emphasize so much that it's not about the data as it exists statically in today, but that it's about like the variation in the data in the data that you can generate, is
Yeah.
because ultimately what we're trying to do is to enable and improve the process for a person, for an end customer, for somebody in the world. We should constantly push it's so easy to get locked into our worlds of, as a professional marketer or a professional technologist, and think in terms of all these terms and all these frameworks that have nothing to do with Matthew as a person living in the Netherlands, or Paul as a person living in Boston, and navigating this crazy world now with 500 million things on Walmart that I could buy and that I have no time for, and don't need 99% of them. And what ends up, if we do that, we remember that ultimately that end person is the arbiter, but is also the supplicant. What you need is to discover and understand and make a decision. In the 90s in Walmart, I could go in and because I was just exposed to the 100,000 SKUs, the SKU was on the wall. I could pick it up. I could feel it. I could look at it. I could play with it, right? Now, all of that sensory is data that as a human, I'm generating, that cognitively I'm evaluating.
Yeah.
And it's cool. What I couldn't really know was I picked it up off the shelf. I could know all its physical dimensions. I couldn't know anything about anybody else's experience of it. So I couldn't know that, Joe tried it and it sucked, or Pete tried it and they loved it. I didn't know all those things. So in some ways I had a richer data context. In other ways, I had less data context. We move it online, and so the less context is I can't pick it up. That's why sometimes, I'm still not very comfortable buying shoes online, because I want to feel them on my foot. And just looking at an image of them is not enough data for me to make a decision. But what's very powerful is I can, on the screen, look at 100 or 1,000 different people talking about those shoes or talking about whatever that product is. That's more data than I ever had in the past. and I can read all kinds of information that probably isn't available, and I can do it at my own time, and I can iteratively look at it instead of
Yeah.
having to go to Walmart and look into the wall. So you got to have more and less data. Now, remember is that in fact, because I've got 500 million SKUs to evaluate in some degree, right? What becomes limited is my attention, my ability to process it. So what is the question for the marketer? What is the question for the product? What is their job? Their job is to give you, remember, we've gone from subway map to Google Maps view of New York City, which means it's no longer useful to look at the city at scale. I should only look at the tiny block that I'm on in all its detail, right? So when it comes to that product, there's so many dimensions to it. Which dimension matters for you as a person? Now, if I have a fixed interface, if my UI shows you three things about the product, and I have to click in to see the reviews, and I have to click in to see the edit, and it's bedded down, and it's scrolled down, all that stuff, then as a data scientist or as a technologist or as a marketer, I'm putting all the responsibility for you as a user to click in, find the stuff. And what you are responding to ultimately as a consumer is that information, the data that I'm showing you to make your decision.
Yeah.
I'm forcing you to navigate through a bunch of data that you don't care
And
about.
and you're
And
exposing your drivers at the same time. I'm not saying it's good UX, practice to say, hide your reviews, but if somebody clicks on reviews, that this one is some highly influential or socially influenceable. Is that a word in English?
yeah, yeah. There's influenceability. There's like effectiveness. There's relevance in the sense
Yeah.
of like it may be a relevant review. It may not be a relevant review. There's a lot of information you're putting in front of somebody, but you're putting it in front of them based on just like, here it all is. It's their job to navigate it because you don't have the control to
Yeah.
know that, Matthew, you only need this piece and this piece. You don't
Yeah. It's
need all.
like in a Matrix. You have Agent Smith and you have thousands of them, but,
That's right.
but that's not the real world. We're
You
all
don't.
unique. Yeah.
That's right. So if everybody is seeing the same thing, if I look at 100 people and I look at their differences in response in terms of which ones buy it, which ones buy it after 5 minutes or buy it after a day, my data only represents one thing, which is that you looked at the page.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about you looked at, why you looked at, what you looked at. I don't have any intent in that traditional transactional event stream data.
I think we spoke about this before we did this recording, and I'm going to plug these guys again because it's still one of the best books that's ever influenced my career. Was Complete Web Monitoring, where you're talking about now is you're looking at the quantitative data, the behavior, but it's not telling you what the driver is. And their statement was that you need to expand that data with qualitative data, get NPS data, get exit survey data, try to see what people are saying about your brand online to try to better understand the psyche of the user. Like, why is somebody buying on a Friday night instead of a Saturday during the day? Or it doesn't tell you. It's just static data points, and trying to get into that psyche takes a whole lot more.
That takes a whole lot more. And when they were writing, the only way to get into a whole lot more was to
Yeah.
go find some other source where that
Yeah.
whole lot more is being expressed. So you might go and try and sort of say, well, what are they saying on their Facebook page? And, are they talking about this? Are they talking about that? And then somehow map that to, what they actually look at and then make some inferences.
Yeah.
What you can do today now, what Agentic represents for me, again, it's the data generating process, is I don't have to show the same screen with the same information to a million people and then just look at their clicks on it and try and, kind of infer what they looked at.
Yeah. I want to circle back to the one after this, but yeah.
Well, the key thing here is you modulate the information, the data that you put in front of in front of users. And you create many versions as you can. And we can talk about the technicalities of like, how do
I
you
was just about to say, you're reading my mind. Yeah.
how do you do that? There's a lot of questions that are important, but just get the idea first. You modulate all those versions, you put them in front, and now that's the experiment, but it's an experiment at massive scale. And then you now can make inferences. Because if I showed you this attribute versus I showed you that attribute versus I showed you that attribute, I used to be VP of data science at a really large consumer real estate platform in India. real estate, consumer real estate is really a hard, complex problem in India because cities are so fragmented, so heterogeneous. There's a lot of different variants. And any given flat or any given property that's listed we had like something about 75, 85 different characteristics of that flat that you could show somebody. Everything from the standard stuff like the square footage and number of bedrooms to does it have an elevator, to does it have a view? And then you could talk about like the image variables, like, when you look at it, are the windows big? Do the pictures look well lit?
Yeah.
Right? So all these attributes. So now, as a person, maybe I need a 3 bedroom, but I can tell you what the thing that's going to determine the 3 bedroom I pick versus not is that I need light. I'm a person obsessed with light, and so if I see an apartment with like small windows or built next to another building and it's overshadowed, absolutely not going to select it. And the recommender system is going to look back and look at my clicks and be like, well, it was a 3 bedroom. Why didn't they like it? Well, it's because it's not expressive enough to know that I was choosing based on the data of the windows and the light. If I can take a message, if I can send you an email, and in one email I can talk about, how well lit this apartment is, maybe
Yeah.
because I extract something about the images and I put it into the text, versus, talk about its great location and proximity to public transportation or whatever else, I can modulate, I can present new information in a shortened form, because we don't want you to walk into a Walmart with 100,000 things. That's too much cognitive load. You don't care about 100,000 things. Anytime you go to Walmart, you care about maybe 5, maybe 30, maybe 60 things, not too many more than that, because it's too much to process, right? But Walmart didn't have any choice. They didn't know what any given person wanted. They can only have one physical store. They can't set up, 100,000 Walmarts in a town of 100,000 people. Obviously, that's bizarre and absurd. So they
Yeah. Give everyone their own store.
right. Yeah. But digitally, why not? Digitally, why not? When you open an application, why do I need to, at the very top, show you 100,000 things?
Yeah.
I don't need to. And also, for any one of those things I show you, why do I have to show you only one version of it? I can show you many versions of it. And when you respond to that or don't respond to that, I can then learn the specific thing you're responding to or not responding. And what the implication of this is, when you have an agentic infrastructure, when you have a product that is running on this, it is not just using the data, it's generating far more data. We've lived in the last 10 years, and everybody's gotten used to believing that we have big data. Let me tell you, language models have shown us a very similar thing. We do not have big data. We have
It's anything bigger than Excel. I mean,
it's Well, yes, but even if you've got gigabytes, even if you've got terabytes of data, that's this compared to what it's going to be in the next 10 years.
yeah.
Data is absolutely going to explode the same way we went from a metro map, or like the kind of map that used to spread out on the dashboard of your car and your father would kind of figure out how to drive to Florida in the summer, to Google Maps, where you can zoom in and zoom out and click and have metadata attached to it.
Yeah.
That's the world of data that we're headed towards, but we're going to have to interact with it and use it in a very different way. And so I don't get caught up on like, I think if you think you're going to have massive improvements in business control and business results because you move today's data around a little easier, you're in for a disappointment. What's
Yeah.
going to
But
happen is it generates so much more, and then you're going to use it more effectively. And that's a much bigger game that we're playing.
so companies would need to, this is what I'm thinking at least, and what I try to push for is that companies really need to focus more on the data that they collect. I think you also mentioned mobile phones in a previous discussion, that the amount of data that they are collecting, that you're able to collect within a mobile app is immeasurable. But I'm thinking also, you were talking about inferring preferences and why is somebody buying it? Why are they skipping buying or showing interest in this specific house because of those small windows? How do you feel that should companies be more proactive in collecting that data? I see a lot of talk about in-app surveys these days to try to get people to answer those questions.
Yes. In essence, yes. What they should be also thinking about is how can they get better tooling in place that allows them to generate and collect
Yeah.
data at a much higher scale. And that also, again, not in a split way, like you have data collection over here and data usage over here and data analytics over here. What agentic represents is infrastructure that can cross those three purposes and
Yeah.
handle all three. Generate more data, kind of collect and move it more efficiently, but ultimately use it more effectively and learn from it more effectively.
And
Uh,
and let's say it needs to make a decision and it knows of a specific data source where they could potentially improve the decision or at least better understand the context, would be able to enrich it through that way as well.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Exactly. And so that's what agentic means. It's like what you're doing is most businesses are in a world where their portfolio, their stack of technology is something that is accumulated historically. So they got one piece that's been there for 10 years and one piece that they just implemented 6 months ago and three pieces that were set up in the last 3 or 4 years. And it's this portfolio, and they probably feel it's very messy, right? And so they're like, what does this new technology mean for all these different intersecting systems that have been invested in over time? And I would say that's okay. The beauty of agentic infrastructure, beauty of infrastructure that has agency, is that it can interact with existing systems. And so what you really should just be on is a learning journey to understand how those systems can be interacted with
Yeah.
and improved.
I think
And if
that's
you're
one of the bigger questions. Yeah.
and if you're in a situation where you're you don't have a big stack, then it's your opportunity to avoid that legacy stack process and actually just start from day zero with agentic infrastructure with a different kind of system. And that's what's
Yeah.
happening, I think, a lot today, which is quite powerful.
Yeah.
Um,
There's one example of a company from, I believe it was Germany, Taloris, and they use RAG to support legacy companies and identity resolution, and it's quite impressive how they do it. But like you said, a lot of companies have started in the last 20 years, so they're fully focused on digital. But I think one of the bigger questions that I see arising now, and like I said, I've had a few questions around as well, is how would something like this fit in? But you answered, there are plenty of ways to get this into an existing stack, to start working with existing data, and actually pushing that further
Yeah, that's
downstream.
right. Yeah, I mean, we've been designing, developing since 2020. Our focus was always to not assume a blank slate and to design the agency to be able to handle existing software systems, primarily based on APIs, but
Yeah.
also based on data pipelines. So I think we have 60 plus integrations. We have all the data stacks that are out there today: your GCP, your AWS, Redshift, BigQuery, your Snowflake, your even the analytics
Let
tools
me get
like
my bingo card here. Hold on.
there and Looker and Tableau. But then you've got your CDPs like a Rudder Stack or a Segment, and you've got your
One more.
all of those marketing, right, your Braze, your
Yeah,
Iterable,
bingo. There we go.
Microsoft. We have integrations with all of those because the agencies operate those tools.
Yeah.
So and like I think you don't, again, you don't have to start from the blank slate. That's not a meaningful, realistic way to evolve in the world.
No, like you said, we might not working beyond petabytes, but gigabytes, terabytes. There are companies sitting on a lot of data,
Right.
and I think being able to surface through inference or whichever method, and being able to derive or automate actions based on that data downstream is going to be incredible. And I think, you guys are in a very interesting space.
Your series, I think, to come back to, you dropped it at the beginning, but I think your series does a really impressive and thoughtful job of kind of like, I would say, sort of seeing the shadows on the wall and interpreting what that means. So I love the context. I love the term context. I think it's a really powerful term, and I love that you built the series on that. I think the how
Yeah.
maybe is there's some room for refinement, all right, and some of the interpretations of where it's appropriate where a language model is going to help you do that versus something else. That has plenty of room for like evolution, naturally so. But your general depiction of the big pieces that are important, I think, is quite fantastic. I highly recommend. I've just you only recently shared it with me,
Yeah.
but I've been sharing it around a little bit, and I think it's a really good representation. Um, And
Well, I think we'll need to schedule another call to get that feedback process for some bonus content. I'm really interested, but like you said, I mean, we're all in this innovation road, this path together now, and as I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of this is just very new. Like I mentioned, AI agents and agentic AI. There are so many terms being thrown on our plates now, and for me, a little bit closer to the source, I can kind of see the picture, starting to see it a lot clearer day by day. But I can imagine for companies, a CMO somewhere or a CDO or a CEO is like they're just having immense difficulties understanding what to do with all of this, what to do with all of their data. So, and the term that I've been hearing a lot lately from vendors is that they are on a not a warp path, but kind of this promotional tour to do education a lot, because I think that's going to be the next drive to really get Martech better understood within the systems or within the companies that are actually using them. I think you still have a quite uphill battle to get that understanding, but thank you for taking the time to explain to me. And I hope that by sharing this online, a lot more people will have their their questions answered as well. And who knows, maybe we can do a follow-up sometime.
We'll be happy to do a follow-up. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, it's uphill. I think, a lot of the joy in life is
for the understanding, right? I think in terms of offering, it's going very well, but making companies fully understand what the impact could be. And,
that's right.
But it's, I think once they do see it, it's great. I'm super excited about it anyway.
I'm really glad to hear it. And thank you for the series again. And it's been great to talk, and happy to keep chatting over time.
Yeah, enjoying your time in Beantown then.
Awesome. Thank you.